Greetings children. Let's start with a new chapter for Class 10 in History, the making of a global world. Let's start. The pre-modern world. When we talk of globalization, we often refer to an economic system that has emerged since the last 50 years or so. But as you will see in this chapter, the making of the global world has a long history, of trade, of migration, of people in search of work, the movement of capital, and much else. As we think about the dramatic and visible signs of global interconnectedness in our lives today, we need to understand the phases through which this world in which we live has emerged. All through history, human societies have become steadily more interlinked. From ancient times, travelers, traders, priests and pilgrims traveled vast distances for knowledge, opportunity and spiritual fulfillment, or to escape persecution. They carried goods, money, values, skills, ideas, inventions, and even germs and diseases. As early as 3000 BCE, an active coastal trade linked the Indus Valley civilizations with present-day West Asia. For more than a millennia, cowries, the Hindi kaudi or seashells, used as a form of currency, from the Maldives found their way to China and East Africa. The long-distance spread of disease-carrying germs may be traced as far back as the 7th century. By the 13th century it had become an unmistakable link. Figure 1. Image of a ship on a memorial stone, Goa Museum, 10th century CE. From the 9th century, images of ships appear regularly in memorial stones found in the western coast, indicating the significance of oceanic trade. 1.1 Silk routes link the world. The Silk routes are a good example of vibrant pre-modern trade and cultural links between distant parts of the world. The name Silk routes points to the importance of westbound Chinese silk cargoes along this route. Historians have identified several silk routes, overland and by sea, knitting together vast regions of Asia, and linking Asia with Europe and northern Africa. They are known to have existed since before the Christian era and thrived almost till the 15th century. But Chinese pottery also traveled the same route, as did textiles and spices from India and Southeast Asia. In return, precious metals, gold and silver, flowed from Europe to Asia. Trade and cultural exchange always went hand in hand. Early Christian missionaries almost certainly traveled this route to Asia, as did early Muslim preachers a few centuries later. Much before all this, Buddhism emerged from eastern India and spread in several directions through intersecting points on the Silk routes.
1.2 Food travels, spaghetti and potato. Food offers many examples of long-distance cultural exchange. Traders and travelers introduced new crops to the lands they traveled. Even ready foodstuff in distant parts of the world might share common origins. Take spaghetti and noodles. It is believed that noodles traveled west from China to become spaghetti. Or perhaps Arab traders took pasta to 5th century Sicily, an island now in Italy. Similar foods were also known in India and Japan, so the truth about their origins may never be known. Yet such guesswork suggests the possibilities of long-distance cultural contact even in the pre-modern world. Many of our common foods such as potatoes, soya, groundnuts, maize, tomatoes, chilies, sweet potatoes, and so on were not known to our ancestors until about 5 centuries ago. These foods were only introduced in Europe and Asia after Christopher Columbus accidentally discovered the vast continent that would later become known as the Americas. Fate, 3 merchants from Venice and the Orient exchanging goods, from Marco Polo, Book of Marvels, 15th century.
Here we will use America to describe North America, South America, and the Caribbean. In fact, many of our common foods came from America's original inhabitants, the American Indians. Sometimes the new crops could make the difference between life and death. Europe's poor began to eat better and live longer with the introduction of the humble potato. Ireland's poorest peasants became so dependent on potatoes that when disease destroyed the potato crop in the mid-1840s, hundreds of thousands died of starvation.
Fig. 4 The Irish Potato Famine, Illustrated London News, 1849. Hungry children digging for potatoes in a field that has already been harvested, hoping to discover some leftovers. During the Great Irish Potato Famine 1845 to 1849, around 1 million people died of starvation in Ireland, and double the number emigrated in search of work. 1.3 Conquest, disease and trade. The pre-modern world shrank greatly in the 16th century after European sailors found a sea route to Asia and also successfully crossed the Western Ocean to America. For centuries before, the Indian Ocean had known a bustling trade, with goods, people, knowledge, customs, etc. crisscrossing its waters. The Indian subcontinent was central to these flows and a crucial point in their networks. The entry of the Europeans helped expand or redirect some of these flows towards Europe. Before its discovery, America had been cut off from regular contact with the rest of the world for millions of years. But from the 16th century, its vast lands and abundant crops and minerals began to transform trade and lives everywhere. Precious metals, particularly silver, from mines located in present-day Peru and Mexico also enhanced Europe's wealth and financed its trade with Asia. Legends spread in 17th-century Europe about South America's fabled wealth. Many
expeditions set off in search of El Dorado, the fabled city of gold. The Portuguese and Spanish conquest and colonization of America was decisively underway by the mid-16th century. European conquest was not just a result of superior firepower. In fact, the most powerful weapon of the Spanish conquerors was not a conventional military weapon at all. It was the germs such as those of smallpox that they carried on their person. Because of their long isolation, America's original inhabitants had no immunity against these diseases that came from Europe. Smallpox in particular proved a deadly killer. Once introduced, it spread deep into the continent, ahead even of any Europeans reaching there. It killed and decimated whole communities, paving the way for conquest. Biological warfare? John Winthrop, the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in New England, wrote in May 1634 that smallpox signaled God's blessing for the colonists. The natives were near all dead of smallpox, so as the Lord Hath had cleared our title to what we possess. Alfred Crosby, Ecological Imperialism.
Guns could be bought or captured and turned against the invaders. But not diseases such as smallpox, to which the conquerors were mostly immune. Until the 19th century, poverty and hunger were common in Europe. Cities were crowded and deadly diseases were widespread. Religious conflicts were common, and religious dissenters were persecuted. Thousands therefore fled Europe for America. Here, by the 18th century, plantations worked by slaves captured in Africa were growing cotton and sugar for European markets. Until well into the 18th century, China and India were among the world's richest countries. They were also preeminent in Asian trade. However, from the 15th century, China is said to have restricted overseas contacts and retreated into isolation. China's reduced role and the rising importance of the Americas gradually moved the center of world trade westwards. Europe now emerged as the center of world trade. New words: dissenter. One who refuses to accept established beliefs and practices. Discuss. Explain what we mean when we say that the world shrank in the 1500s.
Fig. 5 Slaves for Sale, New Orleans, Illustrated London News, 1851. A prospective buyer carefully inspecting slaves lined up before the auction. You can see 2 children along with 4 women and 7 men in top hats and suit waiting to be sold. To attract buyers, slaves were often dressed in their best clothes.
To the 19th century, 1815 to 1914. The world changed profoundly in the 19th century. Economic, political, social, cultural and technological factors interacted in complex ways to transform societies and reshape external relations. Economists identify 3 types of movement or flows within international economic exchanges. The first is the flow of trade, which in the 19th century referred largely to trade in goods, e.g., cloth or wheat. The second is the flow of labor, the migration of people in search of employment. The third is the movement of capital for short-term or long-term investments over long distances. All 3 flows were closely interwoven and affected people's lives more deeply now than ever before. The interconnections could sometimes be broken. For example, labor migration was often more restricted than goods or capital flows. Yet it helps us understand the 19th century world economy better if we look at the 3 flows together. 2.1 A world economy takes shape. A good place to start is the changing pattern of food production and consumption in industrial Europe. Traditionally, countries liked to be self-sufficient in food. But in 19th century Britain, self-sufficiency in food meant lower living standards and social conflict. Why was this so? Population growth from the late 18th century had increased the demand for food grains in Britain. As urban centers expanded and industry grew, the demand for agricultural products went up, pushing up food grain prices. Under pressure from landed groups, the government also restricted the import of corn. The laws allowing the government to do this were commonly known as the Corn Laws. Unhappy with high food prices, industrialists and urban dwellers forced the abolition of the Corn Laws. After the Corn Laws were scrapped, food could be imported into Britain more cheaply than it could be produced within the country. British agriculture was unable to compete with imports. Vast areas of land were now left uncultivated, and thousands of men and women were thrown out of work. They flocked to the cities or migrated overseas. 2t.